Now there was at Citadel in Susa a Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Mordecai is a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin. Verse 6, it gives details on why they're living in Susa. They were taken to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. In the book of Ezra, the Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem. Remember, King Cyrus issued a decree. But Mordecai and Esther are still living in that territory, now ruled by Persia. They didn't return even though they could have. Verse 7, he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. Now the young lady was beautiful of form and face, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Notice the verse introduces Esther by her Hebrew name, Hadassah. The writer is reminding us that though this family has been living in this foreign land, they are still people of God's promise. Esther is her Persian Babylonian name. Esther was orphaned and her cousin Mordecai adopted her. He became the guardian. Verse 8. So it came about when the command and decree of the king were heard, and many young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa into the custody of Haggai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace into the custody of Haggai, who was in charge of the women. The use of the word taken shows that she, nor Mordecai, had a choice in the matter. Esther, along with many young ladies, were snatched from their homes, taken to the king's palace. So this is wrong. In verse 9, she finds favor with the officer in charge of the women, and she was given special beauty preparations. And in verse 10, Mordecai instructed her to hide her identity as a Jew. And one possibility as to why her identity was hidden could be because the Jews made enemies of the people that they had driven out of Israel. We actually learn in chapter 3 of the book of Esther, there's a man who was an Amalekite, one of Israel's enemies, and he plots to destroy all the Jews. So this could be the reason why Esther and Mordecai's Hebrew names were changed to conceal their identity and to stay protected. In verse 11, every day Mordecai walked back and forth just checking on the welfare of Esther. Verses 12 through 13, for a year these women lived in a harem. A harem is a chamber for concubines. One by one, these young women were required to spend the night, each in turn, in the king's bed. And though they lived pampered lives, this is unfortunate. If the king never called them again, they were destined to remain secluded in the harem for the rest of their lives. So notice in verse 14, they are in custody to a man in charge of the concubines. Esther, along with all these women, were victims. This isn't a Cinderella story of a beauty contest. I've read some commentaries that portray this story like it's a contest in search of the next Miss Persia, but we have to read these verses carefully to understand that this was not voluntary. In verse 15, now it was Esther's turn to go to the king, and she found favor in the eyes of everyone who saw her. In verse 17, above all the women, she obtained the king's favor, and Esther is crowned as queen. Now, though this story is ugly and kind of painful to read, when we read it with the lens that these young women were abducted and taken based on their looks, we have to remind ourselves that God has a plan. God can use evil and turn it into good. If you recall the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis, remember he was sold into slavery by his own brothers. He was imprisoned, and yet he knew that what was intended for evil, God intended for good. This is the story of Esther. Esther and Mordecai are exiles in a broken home, in a strange land. She's an orphan, a woman, a Jew, forced into a life she would never choose, and yet God uses her to accomplish his purposes. Here, a Jew becomes the queen of Persia, the queen of an empire which comprised more than half of the known world. Even Mordecai serves a high civil position. We read that in verse 19. Verse 21, he's in the royal court and he overhears a plot to assassinate the king, and Mordecai tells Esther the plot. The plot was investigated and revealed to be true. The men who tried to assassinate the king were killed. And that's the end of the chapter. This chapter reminds us that God uses his weakest servants for his greatest works. In her weakness and brokenness, a victim of malice and hatred of the mighty and political elites, it is Esther who still loves her enemy. She's informing the king of this assassination attempt. God brought Esther and Mordecai to the place where they were the only ones able to rescue the king. And though this king is an enemy, God is going to use the enemy to serve his purposes.